spent 6 weeks talking about the character of God. And I think we would agree that God's character is perfect. So why is the God whose character is perfect, the God whose ways are above our ways, the God who is loving and forgiving at his very core, who is just in all he does, possibly ever disappointing to us? That's a pretty deep question. Now, I think I've shared this with you before, but over the last year or so, I've wrestled with feeling disappointed with God in ways I never have before in my life. I won't go into all of the personal details of that journey, but in this experience that I have walked through, I found myself having to correct some old assumptions about Jesus that should never have been there, and come to trust him in new and fuller revelation of actually who he is, not just who I wish he was. I'm certain that I'm not the only person in this room who's been disappointed by God, if we were all to be honest. And so whether you admit it or not, and I'm not asking you to admit that, you can chew on this all week, all month if you want, but I do feel confident to say that if you are in this room today, you have at one time or another been disappointed by God, every single one of you. You felt it. Which means then that you know a little bit about what I'm talking about and what I'm describing and what I'm going to talk about. The thing about disappointment with God that's so challenging, though, is that it doesn't stop at disappointment. When we feel disappointed with God, it often then leads into this place of disorientation, where we quite don't know where we are or what we're doing or where we should be going. We don't specifically often know when we feel disoriented about our beliefs about Jesus, being disappointed, how then we even move out of the context or the circumstance that's making us feel this way in the first place. We even go, well, then how do I face the world? How do I even be myself within the world if that concrete belief that I've held since childhood maybe isn't as true as I thought it was? And it's this combination of disappointment and disorientation that leads then to something called, here's your big word for this series, deconstruction. This is the overarching theme of this series, deconstruction. So let's define it. Deconstruction really is a buzzword these days amongst many Christians. However, this isn't a new word or a new idea. Deconstruction has been around for about 60 years. It's just especially prevalent in the woke and cancel culture society that we are living in today. The last 12 months, I've read a couple new books, like books written in the last 18 months, on the topic of deconstruction. I've listened to a few different podcasts on this topic, and I've even found myself in a couple fairly heated conversations around this, which indicates to me anyways that Christians are thinking about deconstruction a lot these days, particularly the millennial generation and Gen Z who's coming up behind us. So what is deconstruction? Generally speaking, it's to do the opposite of construct. It's to take something down. For example, we deconstruct old buildings to put up new buildings. To deconstruct is to take something down to make room for something new, even something better. More specifically than that, since the 1960s, deconstruction, this word, broadly applies to philosophy and to literature, and the taking down of cultural values, and the taking down of norms, and the taking down of ideologies. If you've lived longer than about 10 years, you've seen this currently happening a lot in our culture these days. So deconstruction can be traced back to a French philosopher named Jacques Derrida, who is a major contributor to postmodern philosophy. And it's Derrida who's best known for his development of this textual text analysis tool that we call deconstruction. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. Maybe you went through university, learned about this guy. If you haven't, you have certainly felt his influence. You hear it in the media, you read it in books, in conversations with your friends, in pop psychology, and yes, even amongst Christian thinkers and leaders and laymen and women alike. Now, when it comes to theological deconstruction, which is what this series is going to focus on, we can define it just a little bit further. Author and pastor A.J. Swoboda defines it as the process of dismantling one's theological beliefs. By the way, this is A.J. Swoboda is an orthodox Christian. Like, he is not way out there. He's very traditional in what he believes. Pastor and author Brian Zahn defines it as a crisis of faith that either leads to reevaluation of the Christian faith or a complete abandonment of it. Brian Zahn also I would place in the category of orthodox traditional Christians. So deconstruction is the process then of reevaluating, revaluing what it is we believe about God and his church to determine what should remain and perhaps what should go. And though I wish I didn't have to say this, church, we all have beliefs about Jesus that might not be quite accurate. I know. I was shocked too. So to return then to this disappointment with God aspect, what do we do with the disorientation that disappointment creates? Well, deconstruction is a way to make our way out of those beliefs that have likely caused disappointment, to discover that we shouldn't have maybe held those beliefs so tightly. We let them go, we lose them, and something grows in their place that's true and better. Deconstruction is the process by which we might say we lose the Jesus that is false, and we gain the Jesus that is and always will be. Now, it's important to say this. Deconstruction does carry some risks, because through it, this process of casting off wrong beliefs, some also find that it's possible to cast off right beliefs. And I have seen this happen too often and then sadly lose Jesus altogether. I've heard of some very healthy deconstruction, and I've encountered some really dangerous deconstruction floating out there right now too. I guess what you get at the end of it depends on if it was good or bad. Now, as Christians, it is, of course, the Bible that's our primary text for life and for godliness. And so we ask, does the Bible say anything about deconstruction? Does the Bible have anything to tell us and teach us about coming to know Jesus properly and letting go of those assumptions, maybe false beliefs that we've held about him? And my personal belief is that, yes, absolutely, the Bible contains a lot on this subject, actually. The Bible includes stories of people who had to lose some beliefs about Jesus in order to gain some better ones. So starting next week, we are going to examine 3 gospel series that will take us right to Easter Sunday. Stories all on the mother of Jesus, Mary. And 3 stories where Mary loses her son to actually have a better version of him grow in that place. So that's next week, where we examine this lady who had to let those beliefs go down so better ones could go up. But we still have a little bit of time this morning. So what we're going to do this morning is really camp where we already are and use the rest of our time to zoom in on how it is that we come to be disappointed by God, how that leads to disorientation, and then how we come out of that chaos by learning to come to Jesus on his terms, not ours. If you want to follow in your own Bible, you can go to Matthew 11 this morning. Matthew 11, verses 1 through 5. Beginning in verse 1. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, this is the Baptist, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, Should we expect someone else? Jesus replied, back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. This story of John and Jesus is so rich because it's so relatable. I think I say this almost on every text I used to teach, but I think this is one of my very favorite stories in the New Testament. Because it seems I just never tire of reading this story. It never fails to speak to me, and I think it's because John's experience is one that all of us followers of Christ go through, and oftentimes we go through this experience more times than once. It's usually a regular sort of experience, whether we acknowledge it as that or not. And as I was preparing this message, thinking about this and the richness of it, the commonality of John in my life, so to speak, I found myself drawn to the conversational pieces within this passage. So let me isolate really the conversation for you. John says to Jesus, in a sense, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? And Jesus responds, blessed is anyone who doesn't stumble on account of me. John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, the last of the Old Testament prophets, the witness to and the road paver of Jesus, is in prison. The voice of the one calling in the desert is silent in a cell. The one seemingly more convinced than anyone of the messianic mandate on Jesus of Nazareth is in prison for speaking against King Herod's marriage to his brother's wife. And while locked away, John hears of what Jesus is doing. And he asks his disciples to pass on a question to cousin Jesus. The question is, are you the one who is to come? Or should we expect someone else? Jesus, John says, based on what you're doing, I'm curious, are you who we thought you were? Or should we keep looking? Jesus responds to John's question by pointing to his words and his miracles, and he tells John, blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. John's question for Jesus is obviously not rooted in hope in this moment. It's obviously not rooted in comfort and positivity. It's rooted in doubt. And dare we say disappointment. And John is feeling, I think, disoriented. And for anyone then wondering how disappointment with Jesus has anything to do with learning how to trust him better, then I think John's life and his experience here offers an important lesson. And that's this, that disappointment is possible when our expectations of Jesus don't match his deeds. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who's to come, or should we expect someone else? John's ministry of preparation for Jesus' ministry was fiery and almost aggressive in both its message and its delivery. In Matthew chapter 3, you really get the message of John the Baptist, and there we find John hollering out this radical call to repentance. We find him giving a proclamation on judgment over the nation. And then there's this prophetic warning that the Messiah would bring the final harvest of sinners into an unquenchable fire. This is the whole prophetic imagination of John the Baptist, in 4 sentences. John expected Jesus to bring a tangible judgment on the wicked. But though Jesus talked about such themes, and Jesus did, his deeds, that is the day-to-day ministry to the people, was anything but judgmental. It was primarily a proclamation of saving grace, that Jesus would save. Jesus came to save the lost, including the wicked. Jesus said he would save people from their sins. And then he healed the sick and the tired and the broken as a way to show that his kingdom had come and to demonstrate that he had authority to forgive sin. Meanwhile, John, the one who's born to prepare the way for the Messiah, is rotting in a prison cell. Each day moving closer to, you know what? His decapitation. The one who proclaimed a coming judgment for the wicked sat bound and judged by evil, while his cousin, the Messiah, goes on healing, forgiving, and saving everybody else. For John, this isn't how it was supposed to work. And his doubts and his disappointments are real. And he wants Jesus to explain himself and to let him know if he should be looking to somebody else as the anointed one of Israel, the Christ, the Messiah. And for us, for anyone who has ever found themselves disappointed by Jesus and asked of Jesus, are you serious? Is that what you do? Is that what you're like? Is this what I get? I thought you would do it differently. Then I suspect you relate to John. I know I certainly do. And maybe we aren't in a physical prison cell today, though many believers around the world are. But maybe it is from the cell that is our health challenge that we have asked Jesus, are you for real? Maybe it's from the prison of our financial impossibility or our loss of a loved one or being repeatedly overlooked by others that we ask Jesus, should I be looking for someone else here? Maybe it's after the years of serving his church and doing our best to carry and proclaim his kingdom to our friends and family and coworkers that we face something so opposite of reward or protection or honor or provision that it's actually laughable. The type of experience by which we would say, you can't write this stuff. And it's here in this space that we find our expectation of Jesus failing to line up with what Jesus has done and what Jesus is seemingly doing for everybody else. And then we find ourselves lamenting in the language of another prophet, Jeremiah, who in chapter 12 asked, why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease? You've planted them, and they've taken root. They grow and bear fruit. You're always on their lips, but their hearts are far from you. You're far from their hearts. And then verse 3, yet you know me, Lord. Look, what an anguished little verse. Like Jeremiah, we say, God, everyone but me seems to know blessing. Everyone seems to know provision or care or salvation, but I don't, and I should, because you know me, Lord. You know how I've tried to serve you. You know what I've given you. You know that I've testified to your love and your trustworthiness and your compassion and your grace. You know me, Lord, but here I am imprisoned by circumstance. Are you really who you say that you are? Because what I thought you would do and what you seem to be doing just don't add up. And church, it's the juxtaposition of our expectation of Jesus and the deeds of Jesus, the expectation and the deeds, where disappointment is born. For people like us who see through a glass dimly, who don't quite have all the answers, who haven't made sense of everything, this experience of disappointment is unavoidable, and we must learn then to trust Jesus even when he disappoints us. You see, John the Baptist expected a conquering king who would destroy his enemies. Instead, he got a suffering servant who destroyed sin and forgave the world, while John got locked up in a cell. Disappointment had to be navigated. John likely at some moment, church historian Josephus says John the Baptist was probably in prison for a year. Some point in there We have to believe that John wished, maybe even prayed, that Jesus would meet him on his terms, John's terms. But Jesus never did. And he doesn't for us either. We come to Jesus on his terms, not ours. Therefore, it is our terms of this relationship, something we might call beliefs, that often need deconstruction. John needed to figure out what it was that he misunderstood. John needed to figure out what he wrongly believed and expected about Jesus in order to move through the disappointment and into a place of trust again. And oftentimes, so do we. Each of us has inherited beliefs about the Christian faith and specifically about Jesus that give birth to wrong expectations about Jesus. Let me give you a few examples. Each of us has been told promises about God that God never made. Some of us were raised to believe Jesus doesn't heal the sick anymore. Some of us were raised to believe Jesus always heals the sick. Both positions need deconstruction. Some of us were given the belief that Jesus loves us when we're finally holy. Others were raised to believe holiness doesn't really matter because of grace. Both positions need deconstruction. Some of us inherited the belief that we shouldn't raise our hands or praise Jesus with freedom and passion. Others of us were told Jesus must always be praised with wild, charismatic expression. Both positions need deconstruction. Some of us believe Jesus doesn't care if he's praised with singing at all. That needs deconstruction. Some of us think the worship of God is about what we get out of it. That needs deconstruction. All of these points need deconstruction. And we can keep going. Some of us think Jesus answers prayers when there's only enough faith. Some of us think prayer doesn't really make a difference because God just does what he does either way. Both positions need deconstruction. Some of us think Jesus is a friend exactly like our friends. Some of us think he's a father exactly like our parents. Both positions need deconstruction. Most of us over the years have adopted a belief that Jesus is just like us, has our passions, personalities, and preferences, and he likes to do it the way we do it. That needs deconstruction. Some of us think Jesus is a Pentecostal. Others think he's a Mennonite. Some think he's from the Restoration Movement. Others, he's a Baptist. Jesus is a Jew. And when Jesus fails then to line up with these terms or beliefs that have created our expectation of him, boom, disappointment hits and deconstruction becomes necessary. But here is what is so critical to catch. Jesus doesn't fail us. Our broken beliefs about him do. Jesus doesn't fail us. Our broken beliefs about him do. And so this is a really nuanced little thing to talk about Jesus disappointing us, because actually Jesus doesn't disappoint us. It's what we thought about him that disappoints us. But it gets projected and labeled and glued onto him. So this isn't actually Jesus's failed character. It's our misunderstanding that leads to the feeling of disappointment towards Jesus. But the feeling and the experience, well, they're basically the same thing. And so deconstruction is the process of coming to trust Jesus out of that place of disappointment. John had to lose what he wrongly believed about this Messiah and come to trust Jesus based on words and actions, not just his prison cell experience. And he had to do it without losing him altogether. And so do we. Now, here's the great news. Jesus knows that people trip over him. Jesus knows that people trip over him. Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised. The good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." Tripping over our beliefs about the Messiah is part of being a follower of him, I think. I think if you look at just the earliest accounts of those 12 apostles, I think you see a couple people trip up along the way, yeah? It's okay. It's only the fundamentalist who believes that they have all the answers correctly worked out right from the beginning and never need any correction. Everybody else is wrong. But for the rest of us who know that we trip, well, take heart. Jesus knows we will trip. The challenge, though, is to not ultimately fall. John was at a place in making sense of Jesus where he had some serious questions. He's facing real disappointment. But John still asks the question. He didn't pretend he was okay. He tried to make sense of what he was experiencing and what Jesus was doing. He tried to understand the tension that he was feeling. So he asked Jesus, "Are you really the Messiah?" And Jesus answered him. And Jesus' answer for John was both simple and also so theologically robust that it's timeless. And that answer given to John is important for us today, just as it was for him. So first of all, the simplicity in Jesus' response to John is to simply say, look at what I'm doing. Look at what I'm up to. And John had to learn that his experience didn't mean then that Jesus doesn't do anything. And John had to learn that the Messiah was far more, and we all need this lesson, so hear me, concerned with saving people from the prison of sin than he was the prison of tough circumstance. That's a tough one for our Western minds. Jesus is more concerned with delivering you from your prison of sin than he is from your tough circumstance. Most of us would trade delivery for our tough circumstance. We'd take that and let the sin go if we were just going off feeling. Because we're so preconditioned to not having anything go wrong. Happiness, the pursuit of happiness, the right to be happy we talk about. Jesus came to deliver us from sin, not necessarily our tough circumstance. That will come one day. But there's a whole lifetime of bearing a cross and suffering, etc., that Jesus also talked about. So Jesus says, hey, you got to see what I'm doing. I care about sin more than I care about prison cells. And then Jesus backs up his actions with some solid theology. So Jesus says, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed. And when Jesus says this, he's basically touching on a wide variety of actions that were prophesied by Israel's prophets that the Messiah would do. He's pointing to Scripture as well, saying, hey, I'm doing exactly what the Messiah does. Jesus, in a way, says to John, I'm the Messiah. I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And you can look somewhere else if you want. But this is what the Messiah does. Can you accept it? You might need to check how your incorrect beliefs about Messiah have affected your expectations of me, cousin. And then Jesus concludes his response by warning John and all of us. And amazingly, he does it by way of beatitude. And this is the good news. Jesus says, blessed are the ones who don't stumble on account of Jesus Christ. Blessed are the ones who are not so crippled by disappointment, rooted in misguided beliefs that they fall away altogether. Notice Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who don't ask questions. Blessed are those who never have to adjust their beliefs. Blessed are those who never need to be corrected because they have all the answers. No, the blessing is for those who don't stumble. And the word stumble is translated just 2 chapters later in Matthew 13:21 as fall away. The word is scandalizo, where we get scandal. It can also mean to take offense, to be deeply offended by. We aren't blessed because we are perfect. Jesus knows we trip, but we are blessed when we don't fall away because of rooted, deep offense caused by Jesus Christ and our expectations of him. John was invited to know the blessing in believing Jesus based on Jesus' self-disclosure, not according to how well Jesus matched John's vision of him and his expected experience. Verse 6 tells us that Jesus knows people will trip. They'll trip over him. He knows he's a stumbling block, but he says there's blessing for the person who, though they may trip, they don't fall. Rather, they stumble towards Jesus. You see, when it comes to Jesus, we can fall forward or we can fall backward. Deconstruction, I think, is the process of deciding which way we're going to fall. We can fall forward or we can go backward. Deconstruction is the process where we figure out what way we're going to fall. But make no mistake, blessing is available only for the ones who fall towards, not the ones who fall away. And part of the blessing in falling forward is that we lose the Jesus that never actually was. And we find the Jesus who is the beginning and the end. This is what it looks like to discover that part of trusting in God is learning to be disappointed by Him. It's knowing blessing when we don't ultimately stumble. This is what it looks like to find Jesus by losing Him. So as we bring this message to a close, I want to be clear. Disappointment and disorientation are powerful experiences. Far too many a disciple has been lost to the desert that is disappointment with God. Interesting, isn't it, if you think about this? There's no shortage of books and sermons and seminars on winning the lost, bringing people into the fold. It seems that there are far less resources available to the person who feels lost even while they're found. And my heart and the point of this series is to help us make peace with disappointment with Jesus. And to understand deconstruction as the culture feeds you this stuff. My hope is that I can give you a better version, a better vision of it that helps Jesus become more beautiful, that you believe Him better, not worse. To believe more fully, actually, in the orthodox witness of Jesus, not in some 2022 liberal, weird, new age vision of Jesus that He's just like our boyfriend or good buddy, right? We want orthodox Jesus Christ. That is what I'm pointing you to, in case you're confused by anything I've said, okay? Deconstruction is never about a new Christianity. It's about plugging into the creedal and confessional historic faith, okay? We want orthodox understanding, not some new vision of it. One of the juggernauts of church history is a man named Saint Anselm. He was a brilliant thinker, writer, leader. The Archbishop of Canterbury was his title. And Anselm is known for a saying that became really important to him. It almost defined his whole ministry and his theology. It mattered to his students, and I think it's still important for us too. So it was given in Latin, so I'll give it to you in Latin, and then I'll give you the English. In Latin, it's fides quorens intellectum. In English, that literally means faith-seeking understanding. And this little saying means that faith comes before understanding. We don't have to understand God in His entirety in order to have faith and to be in the faith. Faith comes first. But then that faith begins the journey towards deeper, truer, fuller understanding. And that deeper understanding added to the faith is often accomplished through this process of tearing down so new can go up. If you've placed faith in Jesus, be encouraged, you're in. You're there. You're part of the group. But this doesn't mean that we stop learning and seeking to understand Jesus, His church, and His kingdom every day until the end. Like a world traveler with a passport full of stamps, walking as a student of Jesus in a way is to collect stamps of disappointments. All along the way as we lose what shouldn't have been there and gain what should have. To be a follower of Jesus is to join this procession of faithful seeking understanding, all the way until the final day when we do see clearly. Jesus takes a lifetime to follow. We could say He takes an eternity to know. All while suffering a few losses of Him along the way. This is our life. And so if you're in a place of disappointment with God, take courage. A better Messiah than the one you have believed in does exist. But you and I must continue to let go of our terms and meet Him on His. Amen. So as we come to this communion table this morning, the great thing about the cross and closing with communion is that the cross is the greatest example. It's the greatest expression of God doing something that no one expected. God doing something that no one saw coming. No one believed he would do. You know, Paul said of the cross that it was a stumbling block to Jews, and it was foolishness to Greeks. That is to say, it offended beliefs about what a God or the God of Israel would do and what the Messiah was. But this foolish stumbling block behind me gave life. The body of Jesus, the temple of God, was torn down, so something much more beautiful could rise up in its place. And so as we take this meal together this morning, let us receive the life available in remembering the Jesus that we can simply say no one expected. All right? So on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, said, "This is my body given for you. As often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. As often as you take this, do it in remembrance of me." So, church, let's receive this meal together, proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes.